The silence was shattered as Kaiwu Enku moved with blinding speed. With a fluid, devastating motion, the king unsheathed his blade and swung it in a massive arc, a brilliant flash of steel cutting through the darkness. Reika, caught in the sudden violence, was thrown backward, his body slamming into the dirt. He looked up in horror, his eyes wide and breath catching in his throat as he witnessed the carnage. The strike was absolute. The king's blade had torn through the crowd, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. As Reika scrambled in the dust, his face contorted in a scream of disbelief, the king stood poised and calm, having just demonstrated that his mercy was nothing more than a slaughter. The aftermath of the strike left a suffocating silence over the field. Kaiwu Enku stood motionless, his presence looming over the survivors like a shadow. To some, the attack had been so swift it felt as though nothing more than a sudden gust of wind had passed through the crowd. Reika and the others stood in frozen shock, their eyes wide as they stared at the devastation. Among them was a woman with a soft, rounded face and dark hair tied back, her expression one of sheer terror and disbelief. The carnage was precise and brutal. The king had sliced through a massive section of the crowd, leaving a gap in the formation that served as a grisly testament to his power. As the survivors trembled in the dirt, the reality of their situation became clear. They were not being relocated to a new home, but were merely prey in a game orchestrated by a monster. The horror reached its peak as the true extent of the king's attack became clear. A young woman with freckled cheeks and long, flowing hair stared blankly, her expression oddly serene despite the gruesome reality that her head had been completely severed from her shoulders. As her head hit the dirt with a dull thud, the surrounding survivors were plunged into an absolute nightmare. A man with short, light hair screamed in agony, his face twisted in a mask of grief as he witnessed the sudden loss. The scene was one of utter carnage. Blood sprayed across the ground and the faces of those nearby, the violent splashes contrasting with the oppressive darkness of the night. In a single, effortless motion, Kaiwu Enku had turned a crowd of hopeful refugees into a field of corpses. The field descended into a scene of absolute madness. Screams of agony ripped through the air as the survivors realized the horrific precision of the strike. Men and women collapsed in terror, their faces twisted in raw anguish as they looked at the bodies of those beside them. The carnage was systematic and cold. A man in a simple robe stood staring in shock as the head of the person next to him slid away, the blood spraying across the dusty earth. No one was spared who met the king's criteria. The strike had been a clean, horizontal sweep. As Reika looked around at the devastation, a chilling realization set in. Kaiwu Enku hadn't just attacked randomly, he had targeted everyone above a certain height. The strike had landed with surgical accuracy, cutting through any person taller than 4 feet. Death had come to them all in a single, egalitarian stroke. In the king's twisted vision of equality, height was the only thing that mattered, and for those who were too tall, the price was their life. Amidst the carnage, Reika sat in the dirt, his expression hollow and devastated. He stared at the lifeless faces of those who had just been beside him, the weight of the massacre pressing down on his chest. As he looked at the corpses, memories of the people he had known flashed through his mind. He remembered the gentle faces of those who had been kind to him, people who had seen past his status as an outsider. He recalled Gashin's face, seeing the man's severed head lying in the dust, his final thought a whispered thanks to Reika for finding his father. Reika's eyes welled with tears as he realized that the good people he had once claimed to despise were the ones who had actually shown him warmth. He felt a crushing sense of guilt and loss, mourning the very people he had spent years trying to distance himself from. Standing over the ruins of their lives, Kaiwu Enku remained poised and indifferent. He loomed over the scene like a god of death, his long hair flowing in the wind, completely unmoved by the agony and grief of the survivors. As the survivors trembled in the wake of the massacre, a new and more unsettling horror manifested. Reika looked up, his wide, shocked eyes reflecting a terrifying sight in the night sky. High above them, a massive, void-like aperture tore open in the heavens. It looked like a colossal, dark eye or a swirling black hole, with jagged, tentacle-like wisps of shadow trailing from its edges. The atmosphere grew heavy and oppressive as the dark rift expanded, casting a grim shadow over the broken remnants of the Dong-A people. Standing on the ridge, the soldiers and Kaiwu Enku looked on, their silhouettes framed by the flickering light of their torches. As the void pulsated above them, it became clear that the slaughter on the ground was only the beginning of something far more otherworldly and catastrophic. From the depths of the swirling void, strange, ink-like tendrils began to pour out, cascading down toward the earth like a waterfall of shadows. These dark, writhing filaments stretched across the sky, reaching down toward the field of corpses and the few terrified survivors. Reika sat amidst the ruins, his face splattered with blood and his expression one of complete disorientation. He stared at the cosmic horror above, his mind reeling as he questioned if this was all some waking nightmare. As the shadows descended, Reika noticed something peculiar on the ground. A body lay before him, but it wasn't a simple corpse. A strange, ancient-looking seal with intricate markings was etched into the earth beneath the remains. He looked down at the fallen, seeing the distorted, twisted state of the bodies. As the dark energy from the sky began to interact with the carnage, Reika realized that the slaughter hadn't been an act of mindless cruelty, but a prerequisite for whatever ritual the king was now initiating. The horror shifted from slaughter to a grotesque transformation. Reika watched in absolute terror as the ink-like tendrils from the void violently pierced the corpses on the ground, erupting from their chests in a spray of blood and bone. The dark filaments didn't just inhabit the bodies. They wove through them, stitching the dead together in a visceral, writhing mass of flesh and shadow. Reika realized with a shudder that the king was using a forbidden form of spiritual charms to forcefully recreate the Fatch, the soul shells he had learned about in the morgue. As the corpses began to twist and merge into unnatural shapes, Reika let out a desperate plea, begging for the madness to stop. He looked at the remains of his people, the very bodies of those from Dong-A, being desecrated and repurposed into something monstrous. He couldn't bear the thought of these souls being subjected to further agony even in death. Reika looked around in sheer terror to find himself completely surrounded by grotesque, pulsating masses of flesh. These creatures were nightmarish fusions of the dead, with wide, staring eyes embedded in their writhing forms and gaping maws filled with rows of jagged teeth. The horror was absolute. The king had turned the corpses of Reika's own people into raw materials for these monstrosities. Reika could only watch in shock as the creatures emitted unsettling cries of a sound that felt like a sick mockery of new life. Cowering on the ground, Reika stared at one of the beasts as it loomed over him, its distorted body a twisted wreckage of human remains. He realized with a chilling certainty that the freedom Kaiwu and Ku had promised was this: to be stripped of their humanity and reborn as mindless, monstrous servants. Suddenly, a blast of energy erupted behind Reika, throwing him forward as he scrambled to protect a small child he had managed to pull into his arms. He clutched the trembling youth tightly, his face a mask of desperation and fear as he sprinted away from the chaos. As he stopped, he turned to find himself face to face with one of the monstrosities. It was a gargantuan, pale creature with a bloated, bulbous body and a massive, gaping maw lined with needle-sharp teeth. A single, wide, concentric eye stared at him with an expression of mindless hunger, while a thick, viscous saliva dripped from its jaw. Reika stood his ground, his legs trembling but his grip on the child firm as the creature loomed over them, blocking out the moonlight. Reika held the two children close to his chest, their small frames trembling with fear. The young boy clung to him tightly, his face streaked with tears, while the curly-haired girl looked up at Reika with wide, trusting eyes. Despite the blood and grime on his own skin, Reika provided them a small sanctuary of warmth amidst the cold horror of the field. He whispered gentle words to them, promising that everything would be all right and that they were safe. As he looked down at them, a flicker of resolve returned to his gaze, his protective instinct overriding his own terror. However, as he comforted the children, a sudden, agonizing realization hit him. He remembered a promise he had made long ago, and a look of profound grief crossed his face. Tears began to stream down his cheeks as he asked himself who he had even made that promise to, the weight of his loss crashing down on him in the middle of the nightmare. In a sudden surge of adrenaline and raw emotion, Reika's expression shifted from grief to a fierce, burning determination. He recalled a sacred vow he had made to himself, a promise that he would never surrender, no matter how bleak the odds. He stood tall, his voice booming through the chaos as he commanded the terrified children to stand up and fight. His eyes were wide and intense, his face set in a snarl of defiance against the nightmare surrounding them. Clutching his weapon, Reika stepped forward to shield the children, his resolve hardening into an unbreakable wall. With a thunderous shout, he swore a solemn oath that he would save them, no matter what cost it required. He would not let the darkness claim another soul, standing as the sole line of defense between the innocent and the monsters. As he gripped his weapon, Reika looked at the distorted mass of flesh and felt a wave of nausea and rage. He realized with a shudder that the bodies making up these monsters were the very parents, siblings, and friends of the children standing behind him. Fueled by a desire for retribution, Reika lunged forward, ready to fight the nightmare that had been forged from the remains of his own people. With a guttural scream, Reika launched himself at the beast. He swung his heavy blade with every ounce of strength in his body, the weapon cutting through the air in a violent blur. As the blade connected, Reika whispered a brief apology to the soul within the creature, acknowledging the tragedy of what it had become. He felt the impact shudder through his arms, a satisfying thud as the steel bit deep into the monster's pale, bloated flesh. The blow landed true, slicing into the creature with a devastating force. A massive spray of dark blood erupted from the wound, painting the ground and Reika's own face in a crimson mist. With a final, powerful heave, Reika drove the blade further, his expression one of raw, focused rage as he fought to destroy the nightmare before him. Reika stood over the fallen creature, catching his breath as he looked at the wreckage of the beast. He mused that while his blade was sharp, the sheer number of these monstrosities emerging from the void was far beyond what any one person could handle. However, his moment of reflection was cut short. A sudden, deafening roar echoed behind him, and he turned to see an even larger horror looming over the horizon. The curly-haired girl screamed in terror, her voice piercing the air as she pointed toward the new threat. Reika looked up, his eyes widening in shock. A second, gargantuan beast had appeared, its maw opening wide to reveal a cavernous throat lined with rows of jagged, interlocking teeth. Before Reika could even react, the monster lunged with blinding speed. The creature's massive jaws snapped shut around him, trapping Reika and the children within its throat. He struggled desperately against the crushing pressure and the rows of teeth, his face twisted in a grimace of pain and panic as the beast began to swallow them whole. The massive beast's jaws slammed shut, sending Reika and the children flying backward with a violent impact. He hit the dirt hard, his body skidding across the blood-soaked earth, leaving him breathless and battered. As he lay there, gasping for air, Reika looked up at the monstrosities with a hollow gaze. He mused on the tragedy of their existence, noting that these things were born from the corpses of those who had once been human. The creatures continued to loom over them, their wide, concentric eyes staring blankly as they let out their haunting, rhythmic cries. One of them leaned in close, its dripping maw open in a silent, mindless hunger. The children, terrified and sobbing, rushed to Reika's side. The young boy cried out for him, his face twisted in fear as he clung to Reika's bloodied arm. Reika looked at them, his expression a mixture of pain and protective instinct, knowing that the nightmare was far from over. Reika lay in the dirt, staring up at the silhouette of Kaiwu and Ku atop his horse. The king looked down at the carnage with a faint, mocking smile, seemingly amused by the sheer terror and misery of the survivors. To Reika, the expression was abhorrent, a cold laugh at the expense of their suffering. Panic surged through him as he desperately tried to think of a way to fight back. He looked at the monsters surrounding them, realizing the grim reality. How could he possibly kill creatures that were already dead? As the realization sank in, Reika's expression shifted from terror to a sudden, sharp clarity. He remembered the nature of the Fatch and the spiritual arts he had studied in the morgue. A flicker of an idea crossed his mind, a dangerous possibility that might be the only way to survive. He paused, his breathing heavy, as he wondered if there was a way to defeat the dead by using the very logic that created them. Reika's gaze hardened as he reached a desperate conclusion. He tightened his hold on the two children, shielding them with his own body as he realized there was no other option left for their survival. He stood his ground, his expression one of raw, unwavering determination. He decided that he would no longer spend his time in fear or overthinking the impossibility of their situation. He cast aside every doubt, focusing all his will on a single, final strategy. From his vantage point, the king watched with a look of detached curiosity, his long, wavy hair framing a face that remained cold and impassive. He seemed interested to see what the young man would do in the face of certain death. With a fierce snarl and eyes burning with defiance, Reika declared his intent. He vowed that he would fight and win using this one last, desperate plan, refusing to let the nightmare end in defeat. Reika's resolve reached a breaking point as he looked at the monsters. He realized that fighting a creature that cannot die is a fool's errand, and he recalled the lessons from his books. If the enemy is an immortal thing, the most logical strategy is not to fight it at all. In a sudden, desperate move, Reika lunged forward, pulling the children along with him. As the creature's jaws snapped shut behind them, Reika felt the oppressive walls of the monster's throat close in. It was a gamble of the highest order. Reika lunged forward with a burst of speed, clutching the two children tightly to his chest as he dove through the air. Behind him, the massive, grotesque creatures let out thunderous roars, their gaping maws wide and hungry, but Reika didn't look back. He slammed into the ground and kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted across the desolate plain. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thudding of the monsters pursuing him, their pale, bloated bodies churning up the earth. As he fled, Reika's mind raced with a desperate logic. He realized that while the beasts were relentless, they were also mindless. As long as he kept moving and didn't stop, he might just barely stay one step ahead of their reach. He looked back at the towering horrors behind him, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, but for the sake of the children in his arms, he refused to slow down. Reika sprinted with everything he had, his chest heaving as he pushed through the exhaustion. He suddenly spotted a towering rock wall ahead, realizing that the cliff face could provide the cover they desperately needed to evade the mindless beasts. As he neared the cliff, one of the monsters lunged forward, its massive, distorted head snapping at his heels. Reika didn't flinch. Instead, he used the momentum of his run to execute a daring maneuver, narrowly avoiding the creature's jaws by slamming his body against the rugged stone, violently into the air, clutching the curly-haired girl tightly as they were launched from their spot. As he soared through the air, Reika's face was a mask of shock and exertion. Reika plummeted from the sky, his body crashing violently into the debris with a violent force. He didn't have a moment to recover before he found himself staring directly into the terrifying, wide-eyed gaze of the spherical monsters, their gaping mouths ready to swallow him and the children whole. He scrambled backward through the rubble, his breath coming in frantic gasps as he tried to put distance between himself and the creatures. The ground beneath him was a wasteland of jagged stone and dust, providing little traction as he fought to keep the children safe. A sudden, violent impact shook the earth nearby, sending a spray of dirt and rock into the air. Reika looked over to see a heap of the mindless monsters colliding in a chaotic tangle of flesh and limbs, their grotesque forms crashing into one another. Clutching the young boy and the curly-haired girl close, Reika stared at the carnage with a mixture of horror and relief. He was battered and exhausted, but as he looked into the terrified eyes of the children, his resolve hardened once more. He knew he couldn't stop running. The only way to survive this night was to keep moving. Exhausted and battered, Reika finally came to a halt, his strength completely spent. He looked back at the carnage and the monsters, his expression softening into one of profound sorrow. In a quiet, trembling voice, he apologized to the fallen, admitting that he had failed to protect their bodies and save them from such a horrific fate. He whispered a final plea for them to find peace and rest. The two children, seeing the danger had momentarily passed, looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. They realized they had survived the impossible, and a wave of relief washed over them. They clung to Reika, their voices small and shaky as they thanked him for saving their lives. A small, tired smile played on his lips as he slipped into a deep, unconscious sleep. The children grew quiet, their expressions shifting from relief to worry. They gently called out to him, wondering if he was simply resting or if the toll of the night had finally taken its hold. As Reika drifted into unconsciousness, he found himself in a void of absolute darkness, punctuated only by a distant, glowing light. He called out into the silence, his voice echoing with a mixture of hope and longing as he questioned if the figure appearing before him was his father. The figure, a man with long hair tied back in a traditional style, sat calmly amidst stacks of ancient books. He answered with a stern yet familiar tone, reminding Reika that within the confines of this room, he was to be addressed as teacher, not father. Reika looked at the man, his expression shifting to one of deep, lingering pain. He whispered a question, asking if what he had become, a man who waded through death and blood, was something his father could be proud of. The father remained composed, his voice gentle but firm. He explained that if Reika's own physical body had been lost, the very notion of pride or meaning would cease to exist. He emphasized that the only thing that truly mattered was the fact that Reika was still alive. Overwhelmed by the weight of the conversation, Reika's face twisted in a grimace of frustration and grief. He let out a cry of sheer exasperation, telling his father how incredibly frustrating he was, the emotion breaking through his stoic facade as he clung to the only connection he had left in a world of ruins. The father reached out, his hand resting gently on Reika's head in a rare gesture of affection. With a soft, encouraging expression, he told the young man to strive to be better in the next time, acknowledging Reika's hidden kindness despite the hardened shell he had built around himself. As the vision shifted, Reika recalled a poignant memory from his childhood. He saw himself as a smaller boy, standing before his father's tall, commanding figure. He remembered the desperate plea he had made back then, begging his father not to leave him behind and insisting that he wanted to follow in his footsteps. The memory grew more vivid, focusing on his father's voice echoing through the void. The man admitted his own regrets, apologizing for not being able to teach Reika more before they were parted. With a final, overwhelming surge of emotion, the father's voice declared with absolute pride that Reika was a son worthy of honor. The scene culminated in a powerful image of two hands reaching for one another, a luminous light erupting between them as if the bond between father and son transcended the boundary between life and death. Reika was jolted awake by a sudden, violent force, his body snapping upward as he gasped for air. He blinked, disoriented, as he realized he was no longer in the void of his dreams but back in the waking world. As he caught his breath, he noticed a figure sitting calmly beside him. It was a man with a striking appearance, featuring long, dark hair pulled back and a sharp, confident smile. He was dressed in a unique blend of styles, wearing a formal tie and dress shirt under a traditional dark robe. The man looked at Reika with an expression of keen interest, his gaze piercing and analytical. He spoke with a smooth, composed tone, noting that Reika had finally returned to consciousness. Leaning back with an air of casual authority, the man informed Reika that he had a few things he wanted to ask him. As he spoke, he toyed with a small object in his hands, his presence filling the space with an intensity that suggested this encounter was far from accidental. If you like the story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe so that I can keep bringing more such stories for you to enjoy.